Next, going to introduce Michael Volk, who is a Florida registered landscape architect partner at Volk Design Consultants, LLC, and research assistant professor in the University of Florida Center for Landscape Conservation Planning, Department of Landscape Architecture. He has a master's degree in landscape architecture from the University of Florida and a degree in architecture from the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture. Michael has professional experience in planning and project management, specializing in work with historic and waterfront communities. His work with the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning includes work on regional conservation planning and research projects, including several current projects assessing sea level rise impacts on imperiled species and habitats in Florida. Michael, please join us.
Thank you. What I'm going to talk about today is at a slightly larger scale. And like was said in the bio, I work in the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning at the University of Florida. So we do regional and statewide biodiversity, green infrastructure-based planning projects. We work with state agencies, county governments, private NGOs. And so that's really been the focus of my kind of day-to-day work at UF. I've worked with Catherine for the past several years now to help with GIS-based analyses in these project areas that we've had. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those technical analyses that we've done. I won't spend too much time to get into the gory details. So this is just a little overview of what we're going to talk about today. Really what we want to focus on is change that's occurring in the landscape around Cedar Key, in the upland areas around Levy County, and in our project areas we've also looked at Yankeetown and Inglis and the entire coast along Levy County. We've seen some of the detailed models from Marty and Sujin and Luis about sea level rise impacts in Cedar Key. This is really looking at a slightly larger scale. So we'll talk about land use change, sea level rise scenarios, different types of sea level rise scenarios that we've created, some storm surge analyses, and some analyses of conservation priorities and adaptation strategies. So some of you know this probably. In fact, a number of you have probably seen this project. But we have roughly 1,000 people a day moving to the state of Florida. And this is still continuing. There was a brief slowdown during the recession, but it's back up to the pre-recession levels. All of those people need to go somewhere. They need a house to live in, they need a job, they need streets, they need schools. All of this has to happen. We don't see any slowdown in population growth right away. So what that means is that we have to engage in very proactive land use planning to make sure that we allocate, that we conduct zoning planning, that we put people and allocate future development in the places where it's most suitable. One of the projects that was completed and what you're seeing here on the screen by colleagues of mine in the College of Design, Construction, and Planning, Dr. Paul Zwick and Professor Peggy Carr, is the Florida 2070 project. And how many of you are familiar with Florida 2060 or Florida 2070? So we got a few people, and that's good because now I won't be saying things that you already know. So this is a project that was funded by the Department of Agricultural, I should move it up a little bit. Well, I won't get prematurely punched. Okay. Usually I don't use a microphone because I can project and it's enough. But this was funded by the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Services, so the state, but we've had previous iterations that were funded by Thousand Friends of Florida. There was also a private entity that contributed money. But the idea is to look at future alternatives for 2070 in Florida. what could the future look like depending on what way we choose to conduct land use planning. And so what you see on the left here is a map that shows where current development exists in Florida today. So those are all the red areas. You can see the green areas represent existing conservation lands. And on the right is a map that shows, based on current population growth trends, so the trends that we currently see happening, our current trends of land use and development, so sprawl, some redevelopment, some infill, but a lot of greenfield development. All those areas in red are what could potentially be developed by the year 2070 in Florida. And I don't know if I have a slide that shows the statistics, but basically the scenario that we're looking at is to accommodate an additional 15 million people in the state. We currently have about 18 or 19 million as of the 2010 census that this was based on. So it's a big population increase, right? We also, in Levy County, this was done on a county by county basis. I might lie here. I don't think that I did. I zoomed in a little bit on Levy County. So here you can see what this region looks like. Most of the growth that we're projecting in Florida occurs in central Florida around Orlando, along that corridor, the I-4 corridor. But Levy County, as of the 2010 census, had about, about 40,000 people. And this scenario projects an additional 20,000 people roughly moving to the county by 2070. So that's a 50% increase. Those people have to live somewhere. The other piece of this is that it's not just about the spatial impact, but it's also about the water and the resources that those people need, the impacts on septic, on storm sewer, water treatment, etc. And a lot of the growth where these red areas expand and where we see new development comes at the expense of existing agricultural land. That, we're not, one of the assumptions is that we're not allowing conservation lands to be surplused and sold. We're going to assume that those are going to stay protected. So something has to go, and in this case, it's typically the timberlands and the pasture lands that we have throughout Florida. These assumptions are based on suitability. So we look at things like proximity to existing urban areas, proximity to open water. It's a suitability-based analysis, just looking at on parcel, cell-by-cell basis, where are the most suitable places for future development, and then allocating all of the people that we project will move here. So there is an alternative scenario which I didn't show, and there's an alternative option to this. We still have to accommodate people, but we can also increase densities and increase infill and redevelopment so that there's less of an impact on our open spaces and our natural areas. So as part of what we did and what we looked at in Levy County and around Cedar Key, this is one of the ways that we conceive the coastal areas changing. It's not just about sea level rise, it's about these developed areas. It's also about water use, and I don't know a whole lot about this project, but this was a partner project of Florida 2070, where Paul and Peggy looked at existing gallons per day used throughout the state. So the darkest red areas are where we see the most water use in the state. And then by 2070, just based on that population growth and where people go, they also looked at future water use. And so you can see that in Central Florida, again, there's a large expansion of the amount of water that we use. And I've got a slide here, I think, that shows some of these statistics where the line on the furthest left shows our baseline water use in 2010. So that's about 5 million gallons per day, about 5 billion gallons per day, I think. A lot of that comes from agricultural use as well as urban land uses. But if I remember the statistics right, the trend, and fortunately I've got them written, the trend development scenario, so by 2070, if we continue growing at current rates, using current growth patterns, we'll see a 100% increase in development-related water use. And if we use a more conservative and more dense growth pattern, we still see an increase in water use, and I think it's about 54%. We already have droughts, and we already have trouble accommodating the amount of water that people need. So this is a problem. Even if we conserve more water, even if we build and we grow more densely, we still see an increase in water use. So this is really an issue that we have to address throughout the state. So like I said, we looked at the future land use scenarios and the population growth analyses were not really part of the work that Catherine described. These work projects that were funded from Sea Grant that were initially part of our scope in Levy County and Cedar Key, but we referenced these data sets in our analyses and in the work that we did. We also then, of course, did some specific analyses to the project. One of those was to just look at sea level rise impacts throughout the county, and then specifically in Cedar Key, and you saw some of those detailed sea level rise scenarios for Cedar Key. But this map, it's a little bit hard to read, but it shows using a bathtub projection what a 1 meter sea level rise would look like around Cedar Key and in the Rosewood area. And so you can see Cedar Key down here. These blue areas, these light blue areas represent areas that would be inundated by sea level rise. And what I mean when I say a bathtub projection is if you got a bathtub and you say, I'm going to put a foot of water in there, and you start filling it up, that's the way this bathtub projection works on the land, where anything below a 1 meter elevation line, we just assume is filled with water and converts to open water. So it's very simple for us to take an elevation model and to create these scenarios. But there's a more dynamic model that we also used. And this is again data that was created by other people, the Nature Conservancy as well as Warren Pinnacle Consulting. And it's got a great acronym, SLAM. Sea level affecting marshes model. And basically this is a model that is much more dynamic. It's not perfect, but it's much more dynamic than a straight bathtub based sea level rise model, because SLAM also factors into account changes in land cover that might occur, or successional changes, or changes from in natural communities. It factors in, I think it factors in erosion and accretion, as well as tidal fluctuations. So it's more dynamic. And in this case, if you look at these maps, you can't read the legends probably, but the map on the left represents our current, map on the left represents current conditions, where, just again, Cedar Key right here, all the orange areas represent salt marsh, and the light green represent uplands. I think the red represents some sort of swamp-related land cover. On the right here, you can see what that changes to in 2100. So there's a vast expansion of this coastal salt marsh, and in the yellow areas, you've got a fringe of transitional salt marsh. You potentially lose the tidal flats around Cedar Key because the water levels are raising. And you can, of course, already see these impacts starting to happen in Cedar Key with the coastal forest die-off, where we're transitioning from one natural community type to another. This isn't necessarily perfect, but it's more dynamic and probably a little more telling than a simple bathtub model is. So I just have one slide here that shows a little more clearly those areas of change, where the areas in blue are locations that convert to open water with a 1 meter sea level rise, and the areas in blue convert to some sort of other type of wetland, probably salt marsh. So here again, we're not saying everything converts to open water. We might see a great expansion of wetlands potentially in this area. So I think I have 30 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're doing fine.
Okay, good.
At least 5, we can go 10.
Okay. Well, I'm going to hustle just a tiny bit. I don't have that much more. But I did want to show you, we did do some storm surge modeling. I think this was the basis for the analyses that Marty Hilton did. But Catherine can correct me if I'm wrong. So this is using a model called HAZUS, and the dark blue areas show what would be inundated by a base 100-year storm surge, and then those fringes along the edge in pink show what would also be inundated if you have a 0.5 meter or a 1 meter sea level rise. So I didn't zoom all the way into Cedar Key. You can see it a little bit, but clearly Cedar Key is pretty impacted by storm surge. You already know this. But we did want to add this additional layer of knowledge. We did some basic analyses of potential contamination sites that would be impacted by a 1 meter sea level rise. So these could include septic tanks, they could include locations that have to get NPDES permits, storage tank containers. I went through the list of data that we had, and I tagged anything that I thought could be considered a potential contamination source. And I guess the idea is that if those locations are also within a place that's inundated by sea level rise, there's a potential contamination issue that results. There could be a contamination problem before then due to saltwater intrusion into the aquifer or something like that. But we did want to just do a basic look at that. So I think I've got two more parts here. As part of the reimagining the Forum of Cedar Key project, Catherine asked me to do conservation-based analyses looking at what would potentially be impacted by coastal change, and then what strategies we might have to actually help those systems adapt. And I think we ended up breaking the analyses down into 4 sections, which were natural communities, focal species, landscapes, and water resources. And I'm just going to show you examples of the focal species analyses as well as the landscape scale analyses. Definitely don't expect you to read this tab. But to assess impacts, potential impacts from sea level rise on focal species, we used a tool that was developed called SIVA, and I always forget what that stands for, so I put it up here. And Standardized Index of Vulnerability and Value Assessments. And basically what this tool does is it's a qualitative way. It actually combines expert-based input with quantitative data or data that shows sea level rise or land use related impacts on a given focal species. And we can go through our list of focal species that are state concerned, threatened or endangered species, etc. And if you have a collection of experts that can assist with this, we can assess the potential vulnerability or conservation focus that should be placed on each one of those based on 4 different considerations. We looked at just straight vulnerability to sea level rise, what their adaptive capacity is, so how easily that species could adapt, how much information we have about them, and what their current conservation value is. And what this shows, everything in red is a species, each one of those rows in red is a species that is really pretty highly at risk and of conservation concern based on this analysis. Even the green ones look like they're probably happier and less of a concern, but that's just because the range goes from green to red. Those are still actually probably species that we're concerned about as sea levels rise. So based on this, we identified specific adaptation options for species, and this was part of a statewide project that we filtered down, and we took the data and we looked at what was relevant within the Cedar Key region. It's gonna be hard to help focal species adapt to sea level rise. Things like the salt marsh vole, Gulf salt marsh snake, species that are have a very small distribution or small range, or that have a hard time moving across the landscape. Many of those species, what this pie chart shows is that looking at all the species that we consider, 43% of them, the best potential option for them in the short term is to protect current habitat. 42% of them are going to require ex-situ conservation, so actually moving them someplace else in order to protect and maintain that species. And then there are other sorts of potential options too, like assisted colonization. Only 2% of the species that we looked at, we decided that protecting current habitat is a good long-term solution. So it's great in the short term, helps with resiliency, but in the long term, that may not be a viable option. We're going to have to figure something else out. I think the last slide that I want to end with is finally slightly something more optimistic, which is that this is a map that shows, what's that?
We need optimism.
Yeah, right. This is a map showing a project that I work on with the director of our center, Dr. Tom Hochter, and he's actually the brains behind our whole operation. And he's created a database working with other partners called the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. Now, as probably you know, being in this area, not everybody's from this area, but the Big Bend, and specifically the areas just upland from Cedar Key, are part of a critical linkage. These are incredibly important from a statewide or regional standpoint for ecological connectivity. And this is wonderful. And these also, of course, help maintain water quality in Cedar Key for the aquaculture industry and other sorts of recreational uses. So the areas in darkest green are the critical linkages, the most important landscapes from a statewide or regional perspective for connectivity. I guess the optimistic point of this is that we've got great opportunities still to protect these landscapes. There's a lot of existing conservation. We've got opportunities to protect even more still within this really important region and network. And what, this is maybe partially taken from another slide, but the text here shows that there are ways that now we can think about prioritizing what to protect and what to conserve next. One of the ideas is that maybe we should focus on areas that are less likely to be lost as sea level rises. And maybe we should consider focusing on areas that might be threatened by future development. Those are higher risk areas. But these are the types of analyses and discussions that we need to have. And so with that, that's what I have to show. Are there any questions? I don't know if we have time for questions. I should. Thank you.